everyone, and welcome to Medicamentum Authentica. I'm your host, Dr. Andrew Kaufman. And today's guest will be distinguished from some past guests, perhaps. He is also a doctor, a neurosurgery resident, Dr. Anthony Chaffee, who has made quite a name and reputation for himself doing research on the carnivore diet. And I want to say before I bring Dr. Chaffee on that there are three reasons why I admire him and wanted to bring him on to introduce him to you. One is that he, like I talk about all the time, has a very high standard for evaluating research. And most of his positions are highly evidence-based, and this is very important that he applies this kind of rigor. Number two is that he has been willing to speak out about some truthful information about health that contradicts or goes against the official medical position. And he's doing this while he is training to be a neurosurgeon. So this, creates some obstacles to overcome. And I've been there myself, so I really admire how he has pursued and persisted through that. And then lastly, the third and final reason why I admire Dr. Chaffee is that he has actually put into practice in his own life the information that he is teaching. So he is fully consistent with what he says and sets a great example for others in terms of improving your health. So welcome, Dr. Chaffee or Anthony.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate the opportunity to come on, and thank you very much for the very kind introduction.
Well, of course. I'm very selecting about who I bring on here, and I think that you have a lot to contribute to our knowledge base. So as I discussed before, I want to sort of have three segments, and I'd love to start off with you telling a little bit about your personal story, how you came to this information, how it's affected your life, how you deal with being in the mainstream medical system, but yet, giving out this kind of very different kind of information. So why don't you educate us a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, I was always interested in diet and nutrition for my own health and performance as an athlete. I was an All-American rugby player and played sports ever since I was a kid, and always aspiring to be a doctor and studying biology and chemistry and biochemistry. I was just something that I was very interested in, understanding nutrition. You understand how the body works. You understand how to fuel ourselves and hopefully bring about better health. So when I was in my undergraduate degree at the University of Washington in Seattle, I took a class on cancer biology. It was just an interest of mine, and we learned that actually plants themselves can contain toxins that can be carcinogenic. This is not a little known fact. This is actually the WHO actually has a website and a web page talking about that specifically. And there's quite a lot of research showing that there were about 10,000 times more naturally occurring pesticides and insecticides, you can call them, in the plants that they use to deter animals and insects from eating them than the pesticides we spray on them industrially. And the work of Dr. Bruce Ames and Professor Bruce Ames from UC Berkeley, published in 1989, showed that there were 10,000 times more naturally occurring toxins in plants by weight than the pesticide alar that they were looking at. And that mushrooms, for instance, had 500 times more likely to cause cancer than the pesticide alar in animal study. So we were learning that, quite shocking, but we also learned that in botanical sciences and medical sciences, we identified dozens or over 100 known carcinogens in everyday plants and produce that we would eat every day. So for instance, we were told that Brussels sprouts had 136 identified carcinogens back 23 years ago, and that mushrooms, just white mushrooms, had over 100. But also spinach and kale, broccoli, celery, cabbage, cucumber, everything else that you would see in a normal grocery aisle. These were all, dozens of carcinogens in each one. So we were quite shocked by that. And
well, Anthony, if I may interrupt for a minute, this is really very much consistent with one of the concepts that I talk about a lot, which is that we kind of become disconnected from our relationship with nature. And on the one
Mhm.
hand, we can go out for a hike in the woods, to the national forest and know that we can't just go and eat stuff that we see
Mhm.
there, right? We can't just grab leaves and berries because they will be poisonous. But when it
Mhm.
comes to the grocery produce aisle, we walk around and we see the plants, and we've been cultured and accustomed that those things. In fact, we're told that they're super healthy, right? That we
Mhm.
need all of these variety of vegetables and the vitamins contained therein. But since we have this disconnect, we don't realize that, the same things that make many of those, in fact, the overwhelming majority of plants in nature toxic to us and not suitable for food, that those constituents that bring that about, right, are still present in other plants at lower levels, right? And then this can kind of sneak up on us that we can tolerate these things in the short run, or sometimes we might have some symptoms from it that we disregard as not being a problem. Like for example, when we get a lot of gas and bloating eating legumes like beans, right?
Mhm.
So we have this disconnect that we don't realize that these plants that are that we've cultivated as food over the years are also part of that natural world of flora and still contain these ingredients.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you look in nature and you look at other creatures in nature who may eat plants in a natural state, they eat very specific plants. They don't eat the wide variety of plants that we would see on a grocery aisle, and that's on purpose. They may have the defenses and the physiology to break down and detoxify specific chemicals in certain class or families of plants, but they're not going to be able to detoxify all the toxins. There's in botany, it's understood that plants make about 1 million different chemicals, most of which are used to deter animals and insects from eating them. And so we're still in that same category. Those toxins will absolutely affect us. And exactly to your point, you get lost in the woods, you run out of food. You can't just eat any random plant because most of them will be quite harmful. People talk about fruit. Well, the plant wants you to eat the fruit. Not necessarily. It wants something to eat the fruit, but not necessarily you. It's generally birds that are designed to eat these sorts of things. The cassowary bird is a great example of this in the tropics. They eat about 150 different varieties of fruit and berry. Every single one will kill you and will kill most animals because those seeds germinate inside the gut of the cassowary bird. And so it's specially designed to not be able to be eaten by anything except the cassowary bird. So they're made for each other. They're not made for us. And you mentioned legumes and things like that. These are things that we consume on a regular basis, but if we don't put them through a chemical process, they can be quite harmful. Even kidney beans, and this is also on the WHO website. Kidney beans, as little as 5 kidney beans that are uncooked or undercooked. And in fact, undercooked can be more dangerous than uncooked kidney beans. 5 of them is enough to put you in the hospital. So that shows you how dangerous these things can be. Now we can put them through chemical processes and we can treat them and make them less toxic. That's fine. But the simple fact that we can't do that ourselves naturally, the simple fact that we have to cook them or treat them chemically to detoxify them or free up some of the nutrients so that we can access them means that we are not biologically designed to
Right.
eat them. I think we should really think about that.
I think that second point you made also is very important. That the although you can look at the nutrient content of various vegetables, right, and fruits for that matter, and see a lot of high levels of various constituents that would be desirable, right? But not all of those are actually bioavailable because many of
Mhm.
them are right held in sort of compounds that we might call anti-nutrients, right, that hold on to those things for the plant and even can remove them from our body. Like have frequently talked about the children, I believe, in New Zealand who were drinking a lot of milk from cows that were fed kale, and they
Mhm.
developed goiter, right, from iodine deficiency. right? Because of the anti-nutrient, in the kale that's present in other cruciferous vegetables that will actually chelate and absorb some of the minerals out of our body. So this is, another side to the issue that is something, we need to pay close attention to. And, one of the reasons why many cultures have fermented various vegetables to, neutralize some of those problematic compounds and increase the bioavailability of the nutrients.
Yeah, there's a number of different processes that people put things through. Dr. Bill Schindler is a professor of archaeology and paleoanthropology. I think since retired, I think he's doing other things now. But he he gave a very good example of this in Mesoamerica, where they developed maize, corn, and there was a special treatment that they put them through called nixtamalization, which is what the word tamales come from. And I think they soaked them in lye and did a few other things to them, and that would detoxify them a bit, but it would also free up a lot of these nutrients. Like exactly as you say,
Right.
this is one of the ways that plants defend themselves is they try to bind up these essential nutrients in ways that we can't access them because they don't want us to benefit. That it doesn't benefit them if we're benefited by eating them, right? Because they get eaten. And so if they sequester these nutrients away, then it's not really a great idea for things to eat them. So you put them through this process of nixtamalization and you free up a lot of nutrients. The problem was that when the original colonists saw this and back to Europe and the rest of America, and were growing this as a staple crop, it was very easy to grow, grew in a lot of places. It was easy, it was cheap. And so a lot of the more poor populations would rely heavily on corn. And they were getting this disease called pellagra, and it was very dangerous, and ended up a lot of people dying from this. Took a long time to figure out, but someone finally figured out that this was actually a niacin deficiency. And so it was people that were eating corn and weren't able to get enough niacin. They were getting pellagra, and they were getting very sick, and they were even dying. The irony of that is that corn has a lot of niacin in it, and it's just bound up in a way that we can't access naturally, and so it has to go through this production of nixtamalization to free up the niacin. And when you do that, then there's enough. And obviously, if you're not exclusively eating corn, you're going to be covered in other ways. But that's just a very good example of how these plants bind up these nutrients in ways that we can't access, so that we can't access them, so that we don't benefit and profit from eating them as a way of protecting themselves.
It's really fascinating to get in depth into this subject and realize that there's a lot more beneath the surface that is really hidden from the mainstream body of knowledge. But I'd like to get back to your personal story a little bit, because you've been avoiding eating plants for quite a while. Can you tell us a little bit about what are the rules of your lifestyle with respect to nutrition, and how long have you been doing it this way?
Well, yeah. So, I think it's what to eat and where we get our nutrients and proper nutrition from. But I think it's as important what not to eat as what to eat, because there are certain things that we eat that can cause harm. And, just like in the example, the lectins in beans, kidney beans, and different sorts of things that we have to, treat in certain ways. But it doesn't get all out. It doesn't make them perfectly safe, and you can't cook out all of these things, and you can't detoxify everything in every way. So I think it's as important what not to eat. And so my hard rule for myself is no plants, no sugar or any sweeteners, nothing artificial. And that goes for sauces, seasonings, and drinks as well. So I exclusively eat meat. I sometimes have dairy, but almost exclusively I just have meat. Fatty meat, fat's very good for you. Saturated fat is very good for you. This is something that we've been, like everything else, like vegetables and meat's bad for you. This is something that we've been misled by. Saturated animal fats are actually quite beneficial to us and to our health, and very important to us. It's an essential nutrient. It's not just calories. Our brains and our nervous system are made out of fat and cholesterol. And so, something around 70% of our brain is fat. About 20% of those of that is DHA and EPA, and then that does not come from plants, and we don't really make it very well ourselves. You really do need that from your diet, and that only comes from animal sourced fat. So I eat fatty meat, and I explicitly avoid eating plants of any description. The reason being, just going back to that original story, was because when I took that class in cancer biology and were very shocked hearing about how toxic, bad plants were and how toxic they were and carcinogenic they were, or potentially carcinogenic. I remember thinking in my head, I was like, but vegetables are still good for you, like overall, right? And our professor sort of looked at us because we were shocked. Everyone was looking around wildly, like maybe this had to be a joke. And I remember he just sort of looked at us and he just gave us this strange little look. And he just said, I don't eat salad. I don't eat vegetables. I don't let my kids eat vegetables. Plants are trying to kill you. And it really hit home with me. And I don't know if anyone else in that class took this to heart, but I went directly to the grocery store after that. And I was just looking for anything except plants. And I just saw that everything had plants in it. Bread, produce, every packaged meal, everything had plants or at least plant, ingredients in it.
Right.
And so I walked around until I could find something that didn't have plants, and I found eggs and meat. And I was like, okay, I'll just eat eggs and meat. And I was bored for a couple of weeks and looking at all the things that I couldn't eat. And then after 2 weeks, I didn't care. I loved meat. I loved eggs. That's all I wanted to eat anyway. I didn't even look at anything else as food. And athletically, my performance took off, and I was able to train so much harder, so much longer, recover nearly immediately. I didn't get sore, which is crazy to me. I was always sore, but now I wasn't, and it didn't matter how hard I worked out. Didn't matter what I did. And that's one of the things that bothers people the most, I think, is that when I tell them that I don't get sore from working out, it doesn't matter how hard. They get incensed, but it's true. And all you have to do is try it. Just don't eat anything except meat for 2 weeks, and you'll see you won't get sore at the gym. And so I absolutely felt amazing. And I sort of slipped off of it when I was in England playing rugby professionally, because some of the meat was breaded or crumbed, and I sort of convinced myself that maybe it wasn't that big of a deal. The poison's in the dose, and maybe it's not that much. And it did affect me. Looking back, it absolutely affected me and diminished my performance. I was sore more. I was getting little injuries more, nagging pains. And the biggest thing is that it was a crack in the dam, sort of opened up the idea of eating other things, and not just saying I won't eat any plants. So then, 10 years later or so, I came across Dr. Sean Baker's podcast on Joe Rogan, where he's talking about you can just eat meat and get all your nutrients. And at first, when my brother told me about it, he said you should watch this podcast because there's a guy, he's a doctor, he played professional rugby, and he's saying you can get all your nutrients from meat. And at first, initial instinct was, well, that's obviously wrong. But then, voice of reason in my head just said, well, wait a minute. I did that for 5 years, and I've never felt better than that time. That was the period in my life where I've never felt better than that. So I was like, okay, well, I'll watch it. And I just agreed with everything he said. And in fact, I was able to add some of my own personal experience and further research that I'd done after that in cholesterol and fat and fructose and sugar and things like that. And that really opened up my eyes. And I just went, right, I knew it. I knew plants were trying to kill me, get rid of these stupid things. And I just went back to full carnivore, and I exclusively been eating meat since then. I think it's been about 5 or 6 years now that I've exclusively been eating meat again, and I've never felt better. And thankfully I've come across this myself for my own health and the health of my family, who are now doing this as well, and reversed many different health issues, and are now living happy, independent, healthy lives on minimal medication, which is great. But also, now being a doctor, I just looking at medicine from that perspective, that we biologically are designed to eat meat. We are carnivores, if you will, and that plants have toxins, that they can be harmful to us. And everything in medicine just started slotting into place. And I started understanding more about chronic diseases and why they've been on the rise in recent decades. Well, because we've been eating very differently in the recent decades. And I think that that is wholly due to, well, mostly due to the way we've been eating the wrong things. And that's why I've sort of come to the conclusion that these so-called chronic diseases that we treat as a mainstay in modern medicine are not diseases per se, but toxicities and malnutrition, toxic buildup of a species inappropriate diet, and a lack of species specific nutrition. So, namely, too many plants that we are not physiologically adapted and able to detoxify safely, and then not enough meat that has all the nutrients that we need to maintain healthy life. And so, applying that to my medical practice, even as a resident, I think has benefited my patients immensely.
So you must, I mean, do you have the experience where, you're scrubbed in on a case and let's say it's a brain tumor? Are you wondering to yourself, like, if this individual would have just adopted this lifestyle, they wouldn't need to be in here? Are you, how do you feel about your role in that, being in the
Yeah.
operating room, as opposed to being, a voice of education and reason?
Yeah, well, I think that a lot of these things can be avoided. The cancer rates overall have nearly tripled in the last 40 years since the 1970s, since the declaration from the USDA that cholesterol caused heart disease, and that instantly vilified meat and fat, and instantly glorified plants and fruit and grains
Right.
and sugar.
Grains.
Yeah. And so we radically changed the way we ate. We tripled the amount of seed oils we were taking in because we stopped, and we dramatically reduced the amount of meat we were eating. Red meat we reduced by over a third, and started increasing high fructose corn syrup, like grains and vegetables and fruits. We increased this all dramatically. And we had very bad outcomes as a result. The obesity rate tripled, heart disease tripled, stroke rate tripled, cancer rates tripled, type 2 diabetes, autoimmune disorders, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, even neurodevelopmental delays such as autism increased, almost exponentially. They almost didn't exist before then. Now they're almost the only thing we treat, and they are steadily increasing decade by decade. So when I see someone with a brain tumor or other sorts of issues, well, at that point, maybe there's no helping it, and we have to sort of, the horse is out of the barn. We just have to sort of deal with it. But yes, I do think that there is a preventative aspect of it. If you look at the work of Otto Warburg, who's a Nobel Prize winner in medicine, wrote the paper in 1951, I believe, called "The Origins of Cancer." He really argued that cancer was a mitochondrial metabolic disease, and this you see deficient and defective mitochondria in every cancer cell, but you don't necessarily see genetic changes in every cancer cell. And there's some cancers that actually have no genetic changes, which is very interesting. It's not taught in medical school. And I had to find that out later. And, he basically argued and said that if you had healthy mitochondria, that you really couldn't get cancer because they would hold this cell together. And even if you have there's actually some very interesting studies where they took the nuclei of cancer cells with all the genetic changes that we see in that specific cancer, and they would take that out and put that into a healthy cell with healthy cytoplasm and mitochondria, and it does not behave as cancer. They
Yeah.
can actually clone it into frogs and mice and things. And then they took mitochondria out of a cancer cell and put that into a normal cell with normal mitochondria, normal DNA. It did behave as cancer, and they tried to clone it. It just died. It didn't work. And so that was very interesting. And they took healthy mitochondria and put them into a cancer cell, and it suppressed the cancer. So that's very interesting, I think. And it certainly opens the door to think that this is not purely a genetic issue, and that certainly there can be mitochondrial metabolic issues as well. We also know from the work of Dr. Warburg that cancer cells generally well, obviously they have a much higher metabolic rate, but also because of their defective mitochondria, they can't go through the normal processes of making ATP. So they have to go through substrate level fermentation. And this is much less efficient. And so they need much more glucose. So they generally need about 400 times the amount of glucose to operate. And just by going onto a ketogenic diet, which a carnivore diet is, you are going to limit the amount of available glucose to cancer cells. And so there's a number of studies showing that, well, first of all, that if you're on a ketogenic diet for a number of months, that you'll increase the number of mitochondria you have by a factor of 4, and that you increase their efficacy by a factor of 4 as well, because they go through mitophagy, so they replace these older, structurally unsound mitochondria, and they increase their number as well. So they work better, and there's more of them. So that makes the cell work better. And then there's a number of studies.
Well, Anthony, before you go on, let's unpack a little bit of what you said here because it's really crucial. I mean, because I think basically what you're saying is that cancer is not what we're told in the mainstream medical textbooks, right? And there's a wealth of
Mhm.
evidence behind this, right? And it's not just really containing mitochondrial function because also we need to look at like the resting membrane potentials and
Mm.
look a little bit with more scrutiny at the research because to me it makes the most sense, and I've heard others talk about this, that cancer is really a way that your body can sequester toxins that it can't process and eliminate, and
Mm.
that it's a protective mechanism. And at the tumor site, essentially, those things are contained, so they're poisoning the cells that are there containing them, right? And that's where
Mm.
the potentially the cause of the dysfunction, and the properties of water are very involved in this. I don't know if you've looked into research on the fourth phase of water, but it's and Gerald Ling's work, but it's critical to having a bigger understanding of this picture. And what's conspicuously missing from the research is why not just analyze tumor tissue for the presence of a variety of toxins, right? We could look
Mm.
at plant toxins, we could look at glyphosate and various other industrial chemicals and endocrine disruptors we're exposed to and find what's present in these things. The government did a really large study about 20 years ago looking at adipose tissue, and they found almost in more than 80% of the population that they examined had very high levels of dioxins. For example, dioxins have been regulated since then, right? But so then, in many of these people, I think there was a correlation with obesity. So now we have a possible, way to explain obesity in some people, that could it be, possibly storing these toxins? And we know that obesity is a risk factor for cancer, right? So maybe when that
Mm.
system's capacity is exceeded is when we get tumors. But whatever the ultimate truth is, it's
Mm.
very misleading. And if you look in the natural healing world, and you can go back quite a long time and find some even evidence spattered in the mainstream literature that people can overcome cancer very
Mm.
successfully by recognizing these aspects that we're talking about, and kind of supporting the body's way of addressing those problems, right? Through things like nutrition, fasting, cleansing, and also, rebuilding with the proper nutrition like you're talking about. And, the data is a little bit mixed on the ketogenic diet because there seem to be
Mm.
some cancers, right, that respond in a different manner. But you're making a great point here, is that our energy system or our mitochondrial system, we can debate about what the real source of the energy, but we know that the mitochondria are key to health. We know that for us to utilize oxygen, we need the mitochondria to function well. And we know that the inputs for the mitochondria, in addition to the oxygen, is fat. So if we don't have enough fat in our diet and in our body, we're going to have a loss or a diminishment, right, in optimal functioning. And whether that's to heal
Mm.
us from toxicity like cancer, whether it's to boost our athletic performance or just the efficiency of our body's general functions, right, we're at a detriment here if we don't have enough of the right fats in our diet.
Absolutely. And yeah, it is interesting sometimes when you look at some of the research for ketogenic diet, and some of it is quite mixed. The thing is that, a ketogenic diet means a lot of different things. Just like a vegan diet means a very different thing. Oreo cookies and heroin are vegan, right? So you could be on the Oreo cookie heroin diet and probably not do as well as like a whole food plant-based diet.
No, I can't tell you how many clients I've, had with a vegan diet that was, virtually
Mm.
100% processed and,
Mm.
poison food substitutes.
Yeah,
Right.
exactly.
And but you can,
Yeah.
you can do this with anything, right? You can eat a carnivore diet that's largely consists of, processed meats with meat glue and nitrites as
Oh,
well.
yeah. Yeah,
Right.
yeah, you can. Yeah, and so that's the idea. Yeah, so like whole foods, like just eating the meat itself, or even eating the plants itself. Even though plants are going to have toxins, it they don't seem to be as bad as this processed garbage that we are putting out en masse. And a lot of the different seed oils and things like that, it can be are likely very problematic. So you can do keto, and you can still have a lot of things in it that aren't that great for you. Also, something that Professor Thomas Seyfried from Boston College showed that if you look at your glucose ketone index, this was basically almost like diabetics control with HbA1c. This is seeing how much control you have over your state of ketosis, and it found that if you get your GKI sort of under 2 or close to 1, and there's a formula to figure that out, that these people and the mice models and animal models that he uses, they have better outcomes with cancer. Also, another point to make about cancers is they don't only run on glucose. They can also run on glutamine, and some cancers are much more dependent on glutamine for their energy as well. So in my field, glioblastoma is a very common primary brain
Right, and
tumor.
this begs the connection with artificial sweeteners, right? That Dr.
Mm,
Blaylock has talked quite a bit about because of the stimulatory neurotransmitter effects of those which you're talking
mm,
about, right? So it's important to always address cancer, with some specific information as to the type
mm,
of cancer and how it manifests to
mm.
get the best results, right?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and for glioblastomas, they derive around 70% of their energy from glutamine, and so mm, pharmacological mechanisms of targeting glutamine in animal studies are very effective, and combining that with a calorie restricted ketogenic diet has been very, very effective for that particular cancer. From Dr. or Professor Seyfried's work, he had with his animal models that he used in mice. So he would implant these GBM equivalents in these mice. And he had 4 groups. One was a control group, just ate the normal sort of chow diet that these rats eat in the lab. They lived about 7 days. Then on a calorie restricted ketogenic diet, they lived about twice as long. And when they were given this glutamine sort of inhibitor, it's called DON. I forget the full chemical name for it. That they lived even longer than the ketogenic group, like another week past the ketogenic group. But the group of mice that combined ketogenic diet with DON, they didn't die at all, and they found that the tumors receded quite significantly or even disappeared. And once 30 days, when they sacrificed the animals and looked at them under a microscope, they found that most of them had just had clumps of dead cells. There were no living cancer cells in there, so it was very, very effective. Um, and so, but also there are smaller studies. There's one RCT looking at ketogenic metabolic therapy with glioblastoma. There's only about 20 patients, but so it's not powered enough to really get too much information on. But they're all very promising, and they
Yes,
all
yeah.
show that there are some, and there's a lot of case studies and case series that show that some people are very, very have very good success with this. There's a young man, Andrew Scarborough, in the UK, who had an extremely aggressive form of glioblastoma. Glioblastoma is one of the most aggressive forms of
Yeah.
cancer that we know of. The average life expectancy after diagnosis without treatment is 3 months. With full treatment of debulking surgery or resection and chemo and radiation is 15 to 18 months.
Yeah, I mean, this is similar outcomes to acute leukemia,
Mm.
really. So it's a very, very
Mm.
aggressive type of cancer.
Yeah, exactly. And so he had an even more aggressive form of this, so the most aggressive form of glioblastoma. And so he looked at that and said, okay, look, chemo and radiation aren't going to work for me. They don't, my kind of cancer doesn't really respond that well. So he looked at other models, and he found Professor Seyfried's work. and started on a ketogenic diet and fasting, and eventually went carnivore. He's 10 years down the road now. He's done an advanced degree, written a book, and now he's starting his own human trials using ketogenic metabolic therapy with other GBM patients at Charing Cross Hospital in the UK, which is fantastic. And there are more and more like sorry, who is it? Cedar Sinai Medical Center. They've been using this for a number of years, and they're just going into phase 2 trials with ketogenic metabolic therapy in their GBM patients. I actually spoke with Dr. Hugh, who is at the forefront of that, because they were trying to find like multi-center, how to have a multi-center sort of
Right.
approach. I've already spoken to my department about this. We want to do a study as well. Maybe we can do that, but unfortunately, we weren't able to. It's not set up to do that internationally at this point, so not going to be able to collaborate on that one. But I am hoping to get our own study going with our own patients, because we have quite a number of GBM patients coming in all the time, and I think it is very important to
Yep.
at least let them know these things, and at least give them the option of something in addition to the standard of care.
Right. Well, I would actually take it a step further, and I was just going to kind of talk a little bit more about this because, I'm not sure if you've looked into the fasting research, but also fasting has been known anecdotally through, lots of experiences to have incredible outcomes like you're talking about. And one of the things that, occurred to me is that when you do prolonged fast, your body goes into a ketogenic state.
Mhm.
Right. So there could be very similar mechanisms at play here. But unfortunately, in the mainstream medical research, they have done a lot of studies on fasting, but they do two things that completely compromise the results. So one is that they call it fasting, but it's actually a fasting mimicking diet, which is a
Mhm.
contradiction in terms because fasting means no diet.
Mhm.
So, but they
Yeah.
still have excellent outcomes in studies with the fasting mimicking diet, and they have one study with cancer patients where they do a 21-day fast, and this is shown. One thing that you can rely on it is it's completely safe, but unfortunately they combined it with chemotherapy. So they gave chemotherapy like
Mhm.
standard of care to one group, and then standard of care plus prolonged fasting with the other group, and the group with fasting had much better outcomes. But I wonder
Wow.
how much of the improvement was just mitigating the toxicity of the chemotherapy, and if they'd done the fasting only arm, that they would have had superior outcomes. So hopefully,
Mhm.
the research that you do with the ketogenic diet will actually compare just this nutrition to the chemotherapy and not combining the chemotherapy. And, it may be hard to
Yeah.
get a study like that approved, but it's really the only ethical way to do it because we know already the outcomes from chemotherapy and surgery are horrific.
Yeah. I agree. It is a matter of getting it past the ethical ethics board. That's something I actually have spoken with Professor Seifried about, some of his colleagues, and they were saying, "Ooh, could you sort of maybe word it so you get monthly or 3 monthly MRIs, and if there was any progression, then you go back to standard of care. But if there's no progression, then you get to keep going with just the dietary interventions." Um, I will see. I will see
It's,
what I can
it's threatening
do.
to the establishment because
Mm,
aside from a type of preventive therapy that we're not going to mention today, cancer therapy is, the biggest revenue generator in medicine, or the second
yeah.
largest. So if you show that simply changing your diet, right, which you don't need an oncologist to carry out,
Mhm.
it basically is extremely threatening to the establishment. Similar to doing research on home births, from
Mm,
the OBGYN authorities, and they've published some things that where they just basically say that they're analyzing all of the research, but then just take out all the studies that show home birth has better outcomes and only include a
yeah.
couple of tiny studies, and then say home births aren't safe. Or,
Yeah.
um, Anthony, I've looked. One thing I've found is that coffee enemas can actually, if
Mhm.
done properly, can have a huge health benefit. And actually, one of the main successful cancer therapies, Gerson therapy, that's a hallmark of it. And so I looked in the medical literature to try and find, where it's been studied. And there are no RCTs looking at it at all of any kind, even when it's combined with mainstream treatments. You can go all the way back to the 1930s and find in the New England Journal of Medicine a paper just using water enemas in where they had patients with schizophrenia and psychotic depression that more than half of them were completely cured from doing water enemas. Which
Wow.
that if you ask a psychiatrist practicing today if they've ever seen a patient cured of schizophrenia, they'll say no. It's
Mm.
not. They think it's not even possible, right? And then what you find is case reports saying that coffee enemas are dangerous because there's like one case report was like a drug addict who forgot to let it cool down after they brewed it and burned their hiney.
Oh,
And so
goodness.
the conclusion was coffee enemas are unsafe.
Yeah. Well,
We
hot
can't
liquid is
study
definitely
them.
unsafe, as it
Well, yeah,
is.
of course, but the instructions are, that the enema should be at body temperature, not at
Yeah.
175 degrees.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. And that's something that it should be obviously, just common sense that obviously that was the mistake there. It wasn't the coffee that did it. It wasn't any sort of some sort of chemical interaction that harmed the person inherent in the coffee. It was purely based on the temperature.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah.
But
And
this was the way of essentially dismissing this as a viable, legitimate treatment that could be studied in controlled trials. And so,
yeah.
because, the establishment has a vested interest, right, in not allowing, another area of this has to do with the medicinal uses of some plants.
Mhm.
Right, like for example, something that's well studied is cilantro, and
Mhm.
it's been studied in animals where they give laboratory animals toxic doses of heavy metals like lead, for example, and then they have a
Mhm.
control group and then a group that they give a tincture of cilantro, and they even use a methanol tincture, interestingly,
Mhm.
knowing that methanol, wood alcohol is toxic. And
Mhm.
what they found is that when they look at the livers and the brains and other organs, that the ones given cilantro not only have no lead in their organs compared to the control group, but actually their organ damage from the lead was repaired compared to the
Mhm.
control group. So, in other words, they had really no signs of pathology, right? And so, and there are quite a number of studies that replicate this, but yet,
Mhm.
I'm sure, right, in your medical school history, you never heard that cilantro may have medicinal uses, even though
Yeah.
these are all, mainstream scientific publications. They're on PubMed, and there's a wealth of them. Right. So
Yeah.
we're really led astray in our education, and a
Mhm.
lot of it has to do with, I believe, the profit motive, of the
Mhm.
industry. But let's shift a little bit because you said something earlier that the carnivore diet provides complete nutrition. And this, is very surprising to some people. Like, for example, why don't you have bleeding gums and brittle bones from scurvy? So, if you could educate us a little bit about, in those areas that are controversial, like, minerals, um, uh, vitamin C, etc., how are you able to get complete nutrition? Do you have to incorporate organ meats, or where do you stand on this issue?
Yeah. So a lot of people, would think that we would be deficient in certain, vitamins and minerals simply because we're looking at the RDA. So we're looking at these recommended daily allowances. This is how much of this you need, and this is how much of this you need. And they look at meat and they say, well, that doesn't have enough, and so therefore it's deficient. But you look at populations that subsist wholly on meat, like the Inuit, like the Nanette, like the Maasai. They're doing fine, and they're living generationally, generation after generation after generation, in perfect health. And you can't unless you're getting a full complement of nutrients. And so that gives you a bit of a clue into the
So are you
the
saying that really the whole RDA recommendations about which micronutrients and the amounts is essentially not valid? Is that what your contention is?
sure. certainly not valid for someone on a carnivore diet because based on what you eat, you need a different complement of nutrients. Mentioned vitamin C. So, to my understanding, you need vitamin C on a normal diet, a standard diet. You need vitamin C measured in milligrams when you're eating carbohydrates. But when you don't eat carbohydrates, you need vitamin C measured in nanograms. So you need 1 millionth of the vitamin C necessary. Also, what does vitamin C do in the context of scurvy? It hydrolyzes proline and lysine so that we make properly formed collagen that's tight and strong and isn't going to break down and have our gums bleed and our tissue break down and die. Scurvy is very dangerous. It's life threatening. But when you're eating a lot of meat, you're getting a lot of collagen, you're getting a lot of these hydrolyzed proline and lysine, and you don't actually need as much vitamin C as well. And I think you've done a lot more research into vitamin C as well. But at the end of the day, when we have different people that have been doing carnivore for a long time, like myself, I don't take supplements, I don't take vitamins because I don't feel that I need to, and I've put myself to the test. I've trusted in that, and I have not been led astray yet. And when you look at polar explorers like Wilhelmer Stefansson, who was a professor of ethnology at Harvard, and he was a polar explorer, and he discovered a lot of big areas in northern Canada. He lived with the Inuit for, I think, 12 years, learned their language and culture, and he just ate meat with them, and he never felt better. And he wrote about this in his book, The Fat of the Land. And in fact, the people that were the healthiest were the ones that ate, as the Inuit did, only ate meat. And then they were all given orders to only eat meat. And on different expeditions, someone would get sick and they have all these sorts of different problems. And they look around, they find that this person had snuck in like sailor's biscuits and things like that. They're like, okay, I told you don't do that. And then they just feed them meat and they recover. So yeah, I think that then there was an example that Dr. Baker gave in his talk with Joe Rogan, which was on manganese. They said there's not enough manganese in meat, and his point was, well, what do you need manganese for? Manganese is actually used to process and break down plants and plant products and get the nutrients from them. So if you're not eating the plants, you don't need the manganese. This is also when they say you need to eat the fiber in a plant. You don't just juice a plant or extract the fiber because you want these micronutrients in the fiber. And those are essential. Okay, but what do? They help you process and digest and utilize the different plant nutrients that you're getting. If you're not taking the poison, you don't need the antidote. And so you don't need as much manganese. You don't need all the different micronutrients that are in fiber as well. And so in the context of just eating meat, then no, I think that the RDAs don't really apply. They need to be reconfigured.
Well, now it's interesting that you brought up manganese, which is a trace mineral, because there really is no consensus on the which trace minerals are required for health and the levels. And however, it's something that I think is a problem in general nutrition, but I think it mostly occurs with a plant-based diet, and I'll tell you the reasons. Now, manganese also, don't forget, it is a cofactor for superoxide dismutase. So it's also has other roles in the body, and it is, I believe, an essential micronutrient. But ranchers know because their money, their income depends on it, that their animals, if they don't get proper minerals, that they're going to be sick. So ranchers have different options. They can, if they do regenerative agriculture and they restore the mineral balance to the soil, then they can have a self-sustaining system where their meat is mineral rich if the excrement of the meat goes back into the same soil that they're grazing and recycles those minerals, right? Other more, agribusiness, industrial agriculture meat producers, they'll give, essentially supplements, mineral supplements to their animals. And they'll observe, for signs of certain deficiencies. And this is something that if you look in the veterinary literature, actually, you can find way more information than in humans. So I think by eating meat, you're actually more likely to get a sufficient quantity of the trace minerals like manganese because the ranchers know that they have to have adequate levels of these trace minerals in their livestock in order to have a healthy harvest and maintain their living. So this is, I think, a unique benefit of eating this way.
Yeah, and it's a very good point that animal nutrition is a much better studied field than human nutrition. Human nutrition, you can't do randomized controlled trials taking 5,000 sets of identical twins or cloning a bunch of people and putting them in separate identical facilities with identical environments, and then just changing one factor throughout the course of their life. You can't do that. It's not feasible, because we live as long as other people in our study is going to live. And it's not ethical. I mean, you can't do that to people. You can't put them in prison and just study them like that. But when you have livestock and you have them being raised under similar conditions, and you have two populations of sheep, and you just change one thing in their diet, or you change one thing in this additive over here, you can actually see in very, very real terms what that does to these animals. And like you say, it costs money. If these animals aren't as healthy as they could be, or if they die, then the rancher loses money. They may go out of business. This is in everyone's best interest to make sure that animal is as healthy as possible, and to find out exactly how to make them as healthy as possible. So animal nutrition is actually a very, very, very rigorously applied scientific field, much more so than human nutrition, but you can get a lot out of animal nutrition and understand a lot of human nutrition from that as well.
Absolutely. So, we're really learning a lot here. I want to, ask your opinion, of course, because this comes up, and we know that you've debated Paul Saladino about this issue, and I also have had a close relationship with a gentleman named Lauren Lockman, who runs the Tanglewood Wellness Center, which is a fasting clinic in Costa Rica where they do amazing work and people have had amazing outcomes. But Lauren is on the other side of the fence. In fact, I mean, maybe he'd be willing to talk to you in the future about this, but he believes that our natural human diet is principally fruit. And and he's lived on raw fruit for decades, and is maintained good health. And I think this is quite interesting. So thinking about nature a bit and looking at some of our close relatives in nature, that I wonder, do you think that in a seasonal manner that we are meant to occasionally eat some fruits, or do you think there are any fruits that are suited to the human diet, or is this something that you think is really not something that we're suited for, and not a good idea to indulge in?
Yeah. So, well, I haven't debated directly with Dr. Saladino, but I have made videos discussing his position and what I felt about it. And I do feel that while we can eat some fruits, it's not necessarily optimal for us. And I think that's an important distinction. Just because we can survive on something, just because we can gain nutrition from it, doesn't mean that it's the best possible option that we have for peak health and performance. And that's the category that fruit falls into. So, we were talking previously about maybe off camera about fruit in general, and how people say, well, the plant wants animals fruit. They give themselves so that other animals can move the seed. And that's true to a degree, but if you think about it, most fruit and berries are still toxic. They're still poisonous. You can't eat them. And that's because the plant wants something to eat the fruit, but not necessarily us. And most of the time, it's birds that they want to eat these fruits, like the cassowary bird that eats, I think, around 150 different fruits in the tropics. Every single one of those are deadly poisonous to humans and nearly all other animals, if not all other animals. And that's because those seeds germinate inside the cassowary bird, and it won't germinate in the guts of other animals or birds. And so it's very important to that plant that a cassowary bird is the only thing eating that. Are there fruit that are more safe for us? Absolutely. This is why we think that fructose is more sweet, because we recognize this as something safe, because we don't really know if many or really any things that are acutely poisonous to humans that contain fructose. So we recognize this as something safe and that we can eat and we can get some nutrition from, we can get some calories from, and we can survive. And then maybe we eat this and we live to
Right. So
hunt
it
another.
sounds like you would look at fruits as basically, and probably other some vegetables as well, right? As something that
Mhm.
if there was no access to meat, we could survive on for a lean period,
Yeah.
right? But it sounds
Yeah,
like you don't
absolutely.
really
Yeah.
see that that they're free from harm, even if it's only a few times a year when something's in season. And it sounds like your opinion is that there's really no particular fruit that has this symbiotic relationship with humans, as many do with birds or
Mhm.
perhaps even other primates. But you
Mhm.
don't see any evidence of a human fruit pairing like that.
No, I don't think so. I mean, I do think that this is something we can survive on as a survival food, and we're a robust species, so we can survive famines in better stead than like a lion can. A lion, if that does not get meat, that lion will die. We can eat other things and we can survive until we get our more optimal nutrition. If you think about things seasonally, I mean, we had ice ages not all that long ago. Where were the fruit trees during the ice ages? Probably not many. Where were the fruit trees when the people were crossing over the land bridge from Asia into North America? Probably any. And so if we required them, if we were frugivores and we actually require fruit, that's not happening. You can't live generationally like
Right.
that unless you had an abundance of your natural food.
Right. Well,
Um,
just to play devil's advocate, though, you could say that, oh, well, we can survive on meat even though we're designed to eat fruit
okay.
during lean times, right?
Yeah.
So, but it is, like I think if we look at the records of, of man in the past, right, like Weston A. Price's work, for example, where he
Mm,
studied the fossil records of the jaw and teeth of many indigenous cultures who were eating, native diets pre-industrial revolution, right? We can see that that high meat diets correspond with things like bigger bodies, things like wisdom teeth being able to fit in the jaw, no crooked teeth, no tooth decay, and
mhm,
elements like that, right? That help inform us to the present time about some of these issues. And while we
mhm,
know, we can survive on a number of different things that perhaps nature didn't intend us to eat, right? Like we talked about legumes, but grains,
mhm.
is another example. And I've seen some of the information from ancient Egypt, for example, that there they subsisted largely on wheat as other agricultural societies, but had much of the same chronic metabolic illness that we
Yeah.
experience in our modern
Yeah.
lifestyle, right? And they didn't have all of the toxins of the man-made chemicals, in the mix as well. So maybe they didn't have it quite as bad, but it wasn't good. They weren't walking
Mhm.
around with lean body mass and strong and muscular physiques in that culture.
Yeah, I mean, even representative in their statuary, they showed men with gynecomastia and beer bellies. Contrast that with the Greek statues of Heracles and Theseus and things like that. Very different. As to because I'm saying that meat is our primary food and we can use fruits as an alternative. And yeah, certainly the converse can be argued. Well, maybe fruit is our primary. It can be used as a substitute in a pinch. But the problem is that fruits really don't have a full complement of nutrients that we require. They don't have all the vitamins and minerals and proteins and fats and cholesterol and EPA and DHA that we do need, that are required for our life and our existence. And so I think that sort of, while we can eat fruit, you mentioned a gentleman down in Costa Rica. I would wonder if he's taking any supplements or anything like that, because it really is just deficient. Now they say the same thing about meat. They say
Right.
that's these RDAs and things like that as well. But I think that you're not going to be able to survive on exclusively fruit, whereas you can on meat. You get everything you need from meat, and you don't get anything you don't need. And even fruit that has fructose in it and is arguably safer, than a lot of other fruits. That they still have other things. All citrus have furanocoumarins, which are toxins, and our body has to detoxify these things. They're light sensitive, so UV light will hit them, and they'll bind irreversibly to proteins and DNA and damage them. You can even get there are cases of people getting second-degree burns on their hands and arms from squeezing limes and getting the juice on them, and the sun hitting that and just
Right.
scorching. And,
Right. Well,
and this is
many women know this trick of putting lemon juice in your hair and then going out in the sun,
ah,
right? Basically
there
to
you go.
exploit the same thing that would, potentially be poisonous to you. So, this is
Mm,
we all have some experiences with this, and actually, a lot of healing protocols and natural healing use a raw vegan diet for for a time limited period, and then some other things like, for example, herbal laxatives all work because they actually have this toxicity, and they
mm,
basically stimulate or jumpstart your body's detoxification pathways, right? Because it has to get rid of that. And in the process of getting rid of that, it also gets rid of other stuff that's accumulated in your body, right? If we think about, something like cascara or senna, this is really how they
mhm.
work. They're really toxic
Yeah.
to the gut, to the small intestine, and parts of the colon, and so they cause that to spasm to purge that substance out. But while it does that, it also gets rid of the other crap that's been hanging around in your colon from all the
Yeah.
other toxic exposures that you've had, right? So if we're doing this in a purposeful, time-limited way for healing purposes, then we can understand and know what the consequences and not overdo it, right? Like because you can overdo it with these things, but we have to consider that if we are eating this way chronically, right, that we are causing our body to continuously deal with this chronic low level toxicity, and then that can have lots of problems over time. And of course, it's compounded by some of the chemicals that are in the processed foods and the pesticides that allow more of these things to get into the body and overcome the normal barriers in our gut, for example. So it's really kind of a compounded, issue that we really need to educate to get back to health. So, Anthony, I'd like to spend the remaining time here, and I realize that we're going to need to do perhaps another segment in the future to cover all the issues I wanted, but to talk a little bit about, how, practically speaking, how do you go about living a carnivore diet? Obviously, there's some challenges. Like there may be some restaurants that you can order things in, but like being in a social situation around all of this non-meat based food, of course, and then the variety of the palate, restriction of ingredients that you can use. How do you do it, and how do you recommend that we can get started with this type of a lifestyle?
Sure. So I often just cook from home. I enjoy cooking. It's quite easy. Shopping's very simple. I just go straight to the meat aisle and see what I like. I buy in bulk usually, and then I'll cut up my own steaks and sort of salt them, put them on drying racks, and then I'll have a big thick steak. And when they're on the rack, separated so they're not touching and building up moisture, they dry out a bit, the salt soaks in, and they just get better and better every day. It's a trick I learned from watching Alton Brown, who's a celebrity chef, and that was a trick that he said, and I tried it, and it was amazing. And I found that he was saying you would just do it sort of overnight, but I found that multiple days in, it just got better and better and better, browned better, and tasted better. So that's my meal prep. I cut these things up, I salt them, I put them on racks, and then just every night I just take out a big steak and I cook it up, and that's it. It takes 6 minutes, 3 minutes on each side, and that's
So
great.
you just eat steaks then?
Mostly, you know, they're just easier, right? So sometimes I'll do like brisket or other sort of like like a shoulder roast or chuck roast or um, ribs or something like that. We have a smoker, and so I'll use that occasionally as well to slow cook meats as well. Most often, what I'm eating is steaks purely from convenience, because it is quick, and so I can do that meal prep and then I could just grab a steak every day. And I usually eat once a day as long as I'm eating until I'm full. And it's fatty enough meat. There's enough nutrients and fat in it. I find that I don't actually need to eat more than once a day. And so I'll eat in the evening and then I'll be good until the next evening. I don't need to eat breakfast or stop for lunch, and I don't tire at the end of my day. I just feel great all the way through. And then I eat a big steak and I enjoy it. If I'm working out, I need to eat more. I'll often eat twice a day just because my body has a higher demand for nutrients and protein. So generally eat twice a day. So I cook most often. I cook. Even going to restaurants, almost all, unless you go to a vegan restaurant, there's always meat on the menu. You can always get some. You can always get something, and then you just ask, say, "Hey, I just want the meat on its own. I don't need the bread. I don't need the sides or anything like that." They sort of look at you funny
Well,
at
I'll tell
first,
you,
but then
I was in
yeah.
Mexico in February, and I was doing the carnivore diet at the time, and I was trying to get a cheeseburger, right, just on a plate
Mhm.
with, no salad, no bun, and I had to, and my Spanish is good, so it wasn't a language
Mhm.
barrier, but I had to explain it to three people, like so first,
Yeah.
like the waitress, then like the host, and then the cook, like.
Mhm. Yeah.
And they did.
That's
They got it correct after that.
nice.
But it was like it was so foreign to them. But you definitely restaurants are easier. But what about the temptations? With birthday cake and sweets. And I'm not sure if you have children, but when you do have children, everyone just wants to pump them full of candy and junk to
Yeah.
ingratiate themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, well, and that could be more difficult. There's a lot of social pressure and these things, but think of it as drinking. If you're out in a social situation and everyone's drinking and you're used to drinking, you can feel very pressured to drink. And if you're trying to abstain, you're trying to limit the amount that you drink, that can feel difficult, but
Right. Now,
you get used to it.
if you played rugby, you must have had to deal with that issue because I
Oh,
remember
yeah.
in college, a rugby team was visiting for a tournament and we hosted them at our fraternity, and those
Mhm.
guys drank right before a match.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That was yeah. There was a T-shirt I saw once that said, my drinking team has a rugby problem. You know, and so it is very much part of the culture that you drink a lot, and you go higher up in the leagues and things like that, and people wouldn't drink before games, or maybe they wouldn't drink a week before a game if it was a big game or something like that. But almost always you're drinking after a game, almost always.
Right.
And so that was weird for me. I stopped. I had a bit of a head start on that though, because when I was, I think 21, actually just when I was coming into carnivore, maybe this was just before that, I I got sick. I had pneumonia. I was on antibiotics and prednisone, and I was having a rough time. I was not well, but I had a starting spot, and there's a lot of people that wanted that starting spot, and so I had to perform. And so I was on this medication. I was feeling good. I had a good game on the weekend. I was feeling better. And I said, "Great, I'm back at it. Everything's great." Went out drinking that night, full blown again the next day. And I was like, okay, I can't do this. I need to be all the way better before I drink. And so I ended up having to take a month off to get fully better. And during that time, I went out with my rugby team and I felt so self conscious and so weird. And I was at the bar and I was not used to being in a bar situation with these people and sober. And I hated it. It was really awful. But I got through it. And the next week, same thing. I still didn't like it, but it wasn't as bad. By the third week, it was neutral. I didn't really care one way or the other. By the fourth week, I actually preferred it. I was just like, this is way better. I'm not, I'm recovering so much better. I feel better. It doesn't take me 4 days to recover from a game. I'm better the next day. I can train on the Sunday. That never happens. I'm usually just dragging until I get to the Tuesday night practice, and I'm just running the rest of the evil out of me on the Tuesday. I'm feeling better on Sunday, and I can train on Sunday. I can train on Monday, and by Tuesday, I'm already, you know, training sessions ahead of everyone else who's still recovering from the
Right.
weekend. And I just loved it, and I didn't have to. I could remember conversations. I could drive home. I wasn't wasting money at the bar. I was like, this is great. And so I just said, okay. And I was playing. just, amazingly well. And so I decided, okay, well, I'm going to try this. Uh, I'm going to try this for a full season and just see how it goes and just not drink the whole season. And I had the best season of my life. And I was like, okay, great. I'm going to do this for a whole year. The next year, see how it goes. And again, just, even better the next year. And so I just decided, right, I'm not drinking during the rugby season ever again. And so I didn't. And so that was easier for me. And so since I'd already had that experience of just not caring what people thought, like this is what I'm doing, and I have a strong reason for it, and I'm not worried about it. I knew that I could do that, and in fact, I was actually doing carnivore at the time because I just wasn't eating plants, and it was funny because it never came up. No one ever said a thing. No one ever made a comment about what I was eating or wasn't eating. It was just we'd go somewhere and I'd just pick out what I wanted. I wouldn't say anything. No one
Right.
commented.
So
And then
you weren't doing what I did and trying to special order things. You're just like, I'll just leave it on the plate.
yeah, yeah, exactly. Well, I get like even like a hot dog or something like that. We'd be out and they'd have like those street hot dogs or whatever. I was like, yeah, just get a hot dog and just take it out of the bun and eat that. And I just wouldn't say anything. And so and I didn't always necessarily eat out. And if I were to eat out, I just get what I wanted. But again, I did a lot of cooking. My mom loved cooking. She's an amazing cook. She has over 500 cookbooks. She has read and used all of them. And so she's just something that we grew up with. And so I just
Right.
always, and so that was very easy for me.
Well, listen, the only way you can really be healthy with respect to nutrition is by cooking for yourself almost all the time. Because even if you go
Yeah.
to a restaurant and they have, high quality steak, they still could fry it in seed oil, and you'd never know
Yeah.
about it, or they
Yeah.
microwave it, or, who knows what. So it's much, more reliable. But what about other meats besides beef? Do you eat lamb, pork, chicken, seafood?
Mhm.
How isn't iodine an issue if you only eat land animals?
Yeah, I mean that's the argument, isn't it? And certainly depending on where the land animal is raised, if they're more towards the coast, then more sea spray gets into the soil and can get into the grass. But I've never really tracked where my beef is coming from. I've never taken an iodine supplement either, and so there may be something like you mentioned with the cows eating kale and this blocking the utilization of iodine. It could be that again we need to sort of rethink the amount of iodine that we need ongoing on a carnivore diet because we're not having these other influences from plants that are disrupting our normal usage of iodine. I don't know, but I know I don't have a goiter and my thyroid function is normal and so is my TSH. And so that's what I'm working on at the moment. And I have patients in because I'm a neurosurgical resident, but I actually have a private practice in functional medicine and metabolic health. So I actually like on the off days that I have, on the odd weekend that I have off, I'm in my own clinic. So I'm really working 7 days a week, every week. And, we have a lot of
I can
patients that
relate to that. We doctors never stop
Mm.
working.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah. And so, and especially when you're something hot, and you're like, okay, this helps people, you want to make yourself available and see as many people as you can. And so, I have a number of patients with dysfunction or Hashimoto's, and they all improve. They're not always
Right.
improve
Well, I
just
too
with
have had
this
that
diet.
experience. Every client I've ever worked with who, was diagnosed with a low thyroid condition, like you mentioned,
Mm.
all of them 100% have been able to uh,
Mm.
go completely off thyroid hormone and have completely normal
Right. Yeah.
physiology. And those blood tests can be quite misleading, especially the
Mm.
TSH. We can certainly talk about that another time. But I want to ask about dairy because I know I've seen you
Mm.
use ghee, right, which is a
Mm.
form of clarified butter. But what are your thoughts about butter and cheese? And I'm not even talking about milk here because we could just
Mm.
know that it has a high carb.
Mm.
Although certainly I would encourage people to look into the work of Agnes von der Planets and that version of the carnivore diet. I'm not sure if you've looked into that, but you can learn more about raw dairy there. But cheese and butter, which are largely fat, they have high fat soluble vitamins, right, including K2 if they're grass fed. So, what are your thoughts about those types of dairy?
Yeah, well, I think they are have a lot of things that are beneficial. Um, they don't necessarily have everything we need. I don't think they have a complete complement of nutrients like meat would and steak would. And to answer your previous question, I do eat other meats as well. I'm happy to eat other meats, but I just feel best on beef and red meat in particular. And so that's what I just sort of naturally gravitate to. I might have some chicken or pork or something like that, and then or eggs, and then after a few days of this or whatever, I feel like I think I'm really feeling beef. 5 days, and I'm feeling even
Right.
better. I do like beef. As far as dairy is concerned, I think of dairy as good, but it's not everything. And you do need everything. So using dairy as like a condiment, I should use it as a condiment. Like cooking with ghee, I think is a good idea. Obviously, because cooking with butter has a lower smoke point, and you can't cook steaks at a higher temperature that I like to. And but I also use tallow as well, and
I use lard and bacon grease actually, which I just love the flavor
which
of.
are great. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah, those are fantastic. And I found
I tried doing a steak in the butter and then in the bacon grease and I gave it to my girlfriend for a taste test too, and we both liked it better in the
yeah.
grease. So.
It's bacon grease is definitely the gold standard, I'd say, from flavor. Duck fat's really good too. Sometimes you can find a little thing of duck fat, and that tastes amazing as well. And all these things have a higher smoke point, which is great. I do use ghee, grass-fed ghee sometimes as well. But some people do have a problem with dairy, and it seems to be maybe the casein, maybe something else, but some people do react to it, especially people with autoimmune issues. I seem to find that they have more of a problem with dairy for whatever reason, and sort of sticking more to just whole meats and probably more in the red meat side of things. For some reason, again, people, especially with autoimmune issues, seem to have a bit more of a problem with things
Right.
like pork, and it's probably I suspect it's more to do with what the animal's being fed, and it's being fed, some soy pellets and nonsense that it's not designed to eat, and is problems as well. And that's passing on to us, just like the kale and cows. And cows are not designed to eat kale. They eat grass. And so,
No,
something from the
listen,
kale.
I'm a big proponent of that. The animal you eat should be fed its natural food source, right? Because that's
Mm,
how it's going to be optimal. And I do, like I've heard, also observed that many people, eating the ruminants, right? The obligate herbivores like cows and lamb and sheep, don't have problems, but when they stray, and pork, like when a farm factory raised pork is basically fed trash and it's living in its own
mm,
excrement, right? So it's a
mm,
bit different than a pastured pork. Like I went to this fancy goat dairy in North Carolina a number of years ago, where they had like a handful of big dinners a year, and you had to like get on a waiting list in a year in advance to get a ticket. And they basically had goats that they ate the thick shrubs and brush like poison ivy even, and they rented them out. People would pay to have their goats come and graze and remove things that the other animals wouldn't meet, and then the goats gave their milk, and they separated the curds and whey, used the curds to make gourmet cheese, and fed the
mm,
whey to the pigs. And the pigs
mm.
also ate from the vegetable garden. So they had like a really high quality, clean diet. And then they would harvest them for these big meals. And, so that's the kind of pork that you want to experiment with eating, I imagine. And also, with the
Mm.
cured porks, you want it to be, of course, sugar free and with minimal to no seasoning. It sounds like you're okay with smoke, which is really good because I've been stocking up on baby back ribs for the barbecue.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's one of the things too. I think that uh, that we've been cooking meat for a long time. There's fossil evidence that we've going back a very, very long time. We've been cooking meat, and so I think that whatever's in cooked meat and having smoke and open fire and things like that, I think we've probably gotten used to at this point. I think the earliest records I've seen for for cooked meat. It's something like 790,000 years ago, something insanely old like that. And so, and it was the idea that this was uniform heat, so it was potentially like in an oven. So
Right.
probably had been cooking over an open fire longer than that. So I think that we've had smoke on our meat for quite some time, and it's probably okay at this point. It also tastes good, and so and
Absolutely. Have you dabbled in any raw meat?
yeah, well, I just sometimes just because it's there and I'm hungry, I'll
Just cut a slice off one of those
yeah,
aging steaks.
exactly. Yeah, yeah. Well, I remember I came home from work once, and it was a day that I was just like, ooh, steak really sounds good. And so I took the steak out of the refrigerator and I was heating up the pan. Unfortunately, it wasn't a gas stove, so it was just an electric thing. It was just, it takes sort of 10 minutes to heat up. Well, not that long, but it takes a while. And I was just there sort of looking at it, and like those cartoons where they're sitting in a the two animals are like sitting in a boat or something like that, and they look at each other, and then one turns into like a steak or something like that. It just looks like they want to eat the other person. I kept looking at this. I'm like, I really want to eat that. And I was just like, you know what, I'm just gonna take a bite. I just took a bite out of it, like that's delicious. There's nothing wrong with that. I just started like, I think I ate half of this thing by the time the pan had heated up enough, and then I cooked the rest of it. But what I obviously came to discover was that raw steak tastes very much like rare steak, because that's
Yeah.
that's really what it is. And so you cook the outside, and that's fine. The inside is raw, and that's what raw steak tastes like, which is delicious. It's delicious, and especially when you do the salting and the drying out, it does dry out a bit. And so, like when you slice it up, it actually has more of a texture and consistency that you would see in like sashimi, like a tuna, like a
Right.
sashimi, like an ahi tuna. It's amazing. It's very, very good. And so I would cut off little slices of this and sort of eat it, or just actually just take bites out of it. I've absolutely done that. When I first came to Australia, I bought a big ribeye loin, a big and I was cutting that up into my steaks and getting them all set up, and then realized that the oven didn't, or the stove didn't work. And so, trying to get a hold of the Airbnb person, and it wasn't going to get fixed that day. And I was like, okay, well, what do I do? I was like, fine. And I took one of the steaks and just cut it up into little cubes and salted it, and then just let it sit there for a couple hours. The salt soaked in. I just ate these things, just little chunks of meat. Tasted great. There was no problem with that. So,
Right.
um, I
So
don't.
there's, not really a risk of getting sick from it. In fact, I've switched to feeding my pets raw meat like a couple of years ago,
Mm.
and they have had excellent health outcomes from that as well. But what about so-called sour meat or rotten meat? Have you heard about people eating that as well?
I have, yeah, the high meat. Yes, I've seen that, and I've seen some videos of one gentleman who lets this stuff obviously decay in his refrigerator, and it's shocking and alarming to see this actual like mold growing on this stuff, and it's very discolored. And he has to eat outside because he like grosses himself out with the smell, and he's eating it. But he said that he reversed a lot of his health issues, and he feels much better. I do wonder if he could have done the same amount of good on just steaks, just cooking
Right, but
steaks.
surely you've heard the reasoning that we may actually be carnivore scavengers,
Oh
right?
yeah,
And
yeah,
there's some pretty convincing evidence that was in our past, right? So this sort of fits with that we would actually, and I was
yeah,
talking about this with someone recently, and it occurred to me that many of the foods that are considered delicacies have this kind of a
yeah.
smell, right? Like, camembert cheese, natto, right, which is a long fermented soybean delicacy.
Mhm.
So, maybe we, because of the way we're acculturated to, want everything sterile and completely,
Yeah.
washed and like that has led us away. But maybe our natural, palate actually wants rotten meat. You think that's a possibility?
I certainly do think it's possible, and I do think that there are people and different. the local traditions and delicacies of different areas, like the Inuit and the Alaskan natives. They take fish heads and they bury them like a mason jar, and they just let them rot for 6 months, and you take them out, and some people absolutely adore them, and some people absolutely hate them, and
Well, they're getting a
yeah,
lot of collagen.
yeah, I bet, yeah. And there was one thing I was watching. I forget what it was on, but it was a Native Alaskan couple, elderly couple, and and the wife loved these things, and it's just like her favorite thing. So she had all these little jars of fish heads like stashed around their garden and things like that. And the husband hated it, and so he would like anytime we find these things, he'd throw them out, and but every now and then she'd get one through, and she'd eat this thing up, and he said that he would have to like kick her out. It's like she wouldn't be allowed back in the house for a week until she like just stopped smelling so bad. You look at it like Norway. They have one of their delicacies called rotfisk, which is just rotten fish, and it's sort of like lox, and cream cheese is how they eat it. And then they put some cream cheese on a piece of bread or a bagel or something like that, and then they would put this rotten fish, and it looks like lox. It tastes and smells like lox that have gone off, and and it's interesting. It actually tastes pretty good, but it is rotten. And they did that with beef and mutton as well. And this is what they would pack in barrels and bring with them on these Viking raids and things like that. That's what they would eat. And so, I think we're fully adapted to do this. Our pH is that of a buzzard. It's about 1.5 pH, and that's likely because we were scavengers for a long time before we could take down a woolly mammoth or a bison or anything like that. We didn't have the tools and technology to do that right away, and so we had to sort of scavenge and get what we could. And then also, we didn't have refrigerators until last century. So, we had to sort of deal with that, and so we're very likely had to deal with a large burden of bacterial load, and we needed to be prepared for that. So I think we are. I think we're absolutely adapted to doing that. I don't know if we necessarily tried. I don't think I feel the need. I don't think that's
We'll
you know
leave it for
the
the most adventurous among our
yeah, exactly.
for that one. But Anthony, I got to say it's been a fascinating discussion. I really appreciate you taking the time to come speak with me and educate my audience on this topic today. Do you have any last points that you want to make, or if not, please tell our listeners where they can find you and what else you have to offer.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. Yeah, I think we pretty much covered it. We sort of covered a lot of different topics. That was very fun, and I just appreciate the chance to come on and speak with you about it. Um, yeah, so I'm active on social media, unfortunately, even though I don't enjoy social media at all. But I'm on Instagram at Anthony Chaffee MD, and also have a YouTube channel under the same name, just Anthony Chaffee MD, and that's where I post a lot of my videos and different podcasts. And my podcast is called The Plant Free MD, and so people can find that on any sort of podcast platform. I have other sort of things as well that people can find through links on those. Um, but I'm also trying to write a book and sort of put a lot of these thoughts on paper and make a lot of these arguments as to why we should be eating a certain way, and why the previous doctrines on how we should eat are wrong, and what they've been doing to us, and trying to make that our overarching argument that the majority of diseases that we treat nowadays are really toxicities and malnutrition. I think that's demonstrable. You can remove these things, and these issues go away, just like you would expect in an exposure sort of relationship, as opposed to a disease relationship. And I'm hoping to get that out sometime this year, but we'll see how it goes.
Well, I'll definitely be looking forward to that. And let me just let everyone know that there's a lot of different kind of content that Dr. Chaffee has on his platforms, including, academic lectures where he really goes through the evidence, but also, fun stuff on working out, interviews with some other carnivores to talk about their experience, and even stuff on aging meat and cooking. So it's definitely worth it, whatever your current level of interest is, to check it out. And I'm glad that you came here to get exposed to this excellent, novel information on this topic. And I look forward to seeing you next time.
So, well, thank you very much.